Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're diving headfirst into something pretty fundamental.
Mm-hmm.
How the societies we live in, actually shape the very wiring of our brains.
Yeah, it's fascinating stuff.
We'll be looking at a whole range of scientific ideas, historical examples too, trying to untangle this connection between our biology and, well, our culture.
And our guide for this is John Parrington's book, Mind Shift: How Culture Transformed the Human Brain. It's a really thorough look at how all these different fields kind of come together.
Exactly. So think of this as like your shortcut to understanding the big picture, what makes us uniquely human, and how our collective experiences have actually molded our individual minds.
Right.
We're really after those surprising insights, those aha moments, without getting totally bogged down in jargon. Okay, so let's unpack.
Well, one of the first things Parrington points out is just how incredibly quickly we've progressed as a species.
Right.
I mean, in the last blink of an eye, geologically speaking, maybe 40,000 years, we've gone from hunter-gatherer life to, well, space travel.
That is incredible.
That huge leap suggests something really powerful about the human brain, its ability to adapt and learn.
It's almost unbelievable when you stop and think about it, isn't it? From just surviving day to day to sending robots to Mars in such a short time.
Exactly.
And our understanding of the brain itself seems to have been on a similar fast track recently. Some really fundamental shifts in how we see it working.
Absolutely. Like, take glial cells. For ages, they were just seen as, support staff for the neurons, the main brain cells.
Right, just the scaffolding.
Yeah, but now we know they're actually actively involved in transmitting information. It's like discovering the stagehands are also part of the play, adds a whole new layer of complexity.
And it gets even weirder when you look at DNA, right? Parrington talks about the non-coding genome.
Mm-hmm. That massive chunk of our DNA that doesn't directly make proteins.
Yeah, the so-called junk DNA.
Which turns out might not be junk at all. It could be really crucial for brain function, maybe influencing how genes get switched on or off. It just shows how much we're still figuring out.
Wow. Right.
And what's really fascinating here is the growing evidence that even positive experiences can leave a physical mark on our brains.
How does that work?
Through something called epigenetic mechanisms. You can think of them as tiny switches on our genes that our environment and life events can flip.
So our experiences can literally change how our genes work.
In a way, yeah. It really underlines how responsive and adaptable our brains are.
But while all this molecular stuff is key, Parrington really argues that our brains are shaped by our social world in a way that's distinctively human.
Right. It's not just a side effect.
No, it's fundamental, a core part of what makes us who we are, kind of rewiring us throughout our lives and playing a big role in our evolution too.
Yeah, this back and forth between biology and society is central to Parrington's whole argument. He touches on some, long-standing debates about which one has the upper hand.
Like nature versus nurture.
Sort of. He mentions a quote from Jim Watson suggesting our fate is pretty much sealed in our genes. That's genetic determinism.
Right, the idea that genes are the ultimate blueprint, dictating everything from, eye color to maybe even things like competitiveness.
Exactly. It's a simple idea, maybe too simple. Parrington encourages a more nuanced view.
Okay, so what's the other side of that coin?
Well, you've got cognitive behaviorism. That often sees the mind more like an information processor, a bit like a computer.
Ah, right. And CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, comes from that.
Precisely. The therapy focuses on changing negative thought patterns, breaking those cycles.
And lots of people find it helpful, yeah.
Definitely. But Parrington does point to some recent research that's raising questions, especially for more severe mental health issues.
Oh, like what?
Well, there was a big meta-analysis, where they pool results from lots of studies.
Right, a study of studies.
Yeah. Looking at CBT for depression, and it suggested its effectiveness seems to have actually declined since it first came out in the 70s.
Declined. Huh.
Why would that be? Well, that's the question. Parrington mentions potential reasons, maybe changes in funding for mental health services, or even just shifts in how doctors report outcomes. It's complicated.
It just shows how even our therapies are tangled up with bigger societal things.
Exactly. It illustrates how our understanding of the mind and how to help it isn't static. It keeps evolving, influenced by the world around us. Parrington also takes us back in time a bit.
To see how people thought about the mind before all this science.
Yeah. Early ideas were often really limited by non-scientific beliefs. Like
Yeah.
the Catholic Church saw the soul as totally separate from the body, so you couldn't really study it scientifically.
Right, puts limits on what questions you can even ask.
But then you had individuals starting to push those boundaries. John Locke, for instance, he lived during the English Civil War, a time of huge upheaval. And he argued that the mind could be studied scientifically, just like anything else in nature. The social changes around him definitely influenced his thinking.
That's a great point. Even big philosophical shifts are often tied to what's happening in society. So fast forward a bit, and we get to understanding the brain at a much deeper molecular level.
Yes, discovering DNA structure, then sequencing the whole human genome in 2003, those were massive milestones, gave us this incredible toolkit.
But Parrington warns us not to jump to overly simple conclusions just based on genes.
Absolutely. He
Mhm.
mentions things like X-linked inheritance. That's a clear case where genes directly influence traits. But then he looks at studies on intelligence.
The IQ debate.
Yeah, the specific gene regions identified so far, they only explain a tiny fraction, like maybe 5% of the variation in IQ scores.
Only 5%? Wow.
And that's before you even get into the whole debate about what IQ tests actually measure. Is it innate ability or is it heavily influenced by education and background?
Right, it's really hard to untangle.
And remember the whole gay gene thing back in the 90s?
Vaguely, yeah. There was a lot of buzz.
Huge buzz. But later research just couldn't find a single gene responsible. It really shows how complex the link between genes and behavior actually is.
So it's not one gene equals one trait.
Definitely not. Parrington really stresses that the brain isn't just a collection of separate modules controlled by individual genes.
Oh, it's this incredibly complex, interconnected system.
Exactly. And that complexity gets missed in views that try to pin consciousness down to one gene or one brain area, ignoring how it all actually works together.
So we need to be careful about biological explanations that don't factor in culture and environment.
Precisely. Otherwise, we risk falling into the same traps as earlier thinkers who either thought the mind was unknowable or just treated it like a black box.
Okay, let's switch gears a bit. What about the impact of tools and symbols? Parrington discusses this too, Rick.
Oh, hugely. He starts with Friedrich Engel's observation that walking upright freed our hands for tool use, a really pivotal moment.
Makes sense.
But what's really interesting is that the timeline for tool use keeps getting pushed back.
Older than we thought.
Much older. They found stone tools dating back 3.3 million years. That suggests even early human ancestors with smaller brains, like Australopithecus afarensis.
Lucy's species.
Yeah, possibly them. They were likely making and using tools probably for butchering animals.
Oh, wow. With brains much smaller than ours, that really makes you rethink the link between brain size and technology.
It does. And then there's communication. Parrington looks at attempts to teach language to apes.
Like Coco the gorilla.
Exactly. Coco was captivating. But the research raises big questions. Were the responses genuine language or more like clever responses prompted by the researchers? Researcher bias is a real issue there.
Right. It's hard not to project human abilities onto animals. But what about chimps in the wild?
Well, some studies suggest wild chimps have a kind of lexicon of gestures with specific meanings.
Really? Like a sign language?
Sort of. But researchers like Catherine Hobader also point out that some gestures can be ambiguous. They mean different things in different contexts.
Okay, so it's complex, but maybe not quite human language complex.
Seems that way. Which brings us to human language itself. Parrington moves past the old idea of it just being conditioned reflexes, like Pavlov's dogs.
And he challenges Chomsky, too. The universal grammar idea.
He does. There's growing evidence that human language development is this intricate dance between our biological readiness for it and the specific social environment we grow up in.
So nature and nurture working together really closely.
Exactly. Parrington says we'll get more into the specifics, genes, brain areas, environment later on. But for now, let's think about how individuals and society connect.
Okay.
He starts way back with feudal societies. There, your place was pretty much fixed by birth, not by what you could do.
Right, like in that old hymn, all things bright and beautiful, the rich man in his castle, the poor man at his gate.
Exactly. That hymn really captures that rigid social order, even though it was written much later. But then Parrington talks about the rise of individualism.
The Renaissance. Thinkers like Descartes. I think, therefore I am.
Right, and Rousseau. Putting the individual front and center, this became a really powerful idea, especially for emerging social classes.
And how does this connect to the brain, the social brain?
Well, fMRI studies brain scans show some fascinating things, like comforting someone else. It actually activates the reward centers in your brain more strongly than when you receive comfort.
Seriously? That's amazing.
Matthew Lieberman's work suggests a deep evolutionary root for our prosocial behavior. We're wired to connect, and then there's this default activity in the brain, the stuff that's going on when we're not focused on a task.
What about it?
A lot of it happens in areas linked to social thinking, thinking about other people's minds, intentions. Lieberman thinks our brains are basically always primed for social interaction, even when we're just daydreaming.
It's like being social is our default setting.
Pretty much. And language, according to Lev Vygotsky, is crucial for shaping our individual consciousness within this social world.
Okay, Vygotsky. How did his ideas differ from, say, Piaget?
Well, Piaget focused more on inborn developmental stages. Vygotsky really emphasized how social interaction and language transform our basic mental functions into more complex, higher-level thinking.
So culture doesn't just add things, it actually reshapes how we think.
Exactly. He saw the child as actively being restructured by culture. Parrington gives this great example, a study in a Mexican community in Tucson.
What did they find?
They found that teaching literacy worked much better when they connected it directly to the kids' everyday lives and the community context, rather than just abstract drills.
That makes so much sense. Learning isn't just in your head, it's tied to your life.
Precisely. It's deeply embedded. Now, should we dig a bit deeper into brain evolution and development itself?
Yeah, let's do that. But you mentioned fossils have limitations.
They do. Skulls tell you about brain size, roughly, but not the internal wiring. So comparing human brains to chimp brains is really informative.
Our closest living relatives, what's the main difference?
According to researchers like Susanna Herculano-Husel, it's largely the expansion of the cerebral cortex, especially areas involved in integrating information, planning, abstract thought, higher cognitive stuff.
So not just bigger, but with more processing power in key areas.
You got it. And genes, of course, lay the foundation for this development. Parrington gives a quick refresher on genes and protein synthesis.
The whole DNA to RNA to protein thing.
Right, the central dogma. And the Human Genome Project, giving us that full DNA sequence, was obviously huge.
But it's not just the genes, is it? You mentioned environment earlier?
Absolutely critical. Parrington brings up those classic Hobel and Weisel experiments with cats' vision.
Oh yeah, the ones with kittens in the dark.
Well, controlling their visual input, they show dramatically how sensory experience during critical periods is essential for wiring up the brain correctly.
So experience shapes the physical structure.
It does. And now, with genetic engineering in animals like knockout mice where a gene is switched off, or even recent work in primates, scientists can study the precise roles of specific genes in brain development, including complex areas like the prefrontal cortex.
Which is involved in decision-making and stuff.
Right. And this brings us back to that constant interplay between our biology and our culture. Parrington really hammers this home, drawing on Vygotsky again, the idea that culture restructures our basic mental abilities.
Okay. What about memory? How does that work at a cellular level?
Parrington talks about Bliss and Lumo's discovery of long-term potentiation, LTP.
Right. Strengthening connections between neurons.
Exactly. When neurons fire together repeatedly, the connection, the synapse, gets stronger. That's seen as a key mechanism for learning and memory.
But it's more than just the synapse changing.
Seems so. There's growing evidence for changes in gene expression, turning genes on or off, and also these small regulatory RNA molecules playing a role in locking in long-term memories.
RNA. Interesting.
And even more intricate, these tiny packages called exosomes can shuttle these RNAs and other molecules between neurons, even to glial cells. It suggests a really dynamic communication network.
Wow, the brain is busy.
Definitely. And the famous case of HM, Henry Molaison.
The man who couldn't form new memories.
Right. After surgery removed his hippocampus, his case was pivotal. It showed that forming new memories relies heavily on the hippocampus, but storing long-term memories involves other areas, likely including the prefrontal cortex.
Different jobs for different parts.
And then you get those incredibly specific neurons, like the Jennifer Aniston neuron or the Eiffel Tower neuron.
Wait, neurons for specific people or places?
Apparently. Individual neurons that fire specifically in response to seeing or thinking about a particular concept, it hints at a really precise coding system.
That's wild. How does the brain organize all that?
Good question. Parrington also mentions the impact of early life experiences. There's a study linking nurturing parenting at age 4 to a larger hippocampus and better memory later on.
So nurture physically shapes the memory structures.
It really seems to, underscores the importance of that early social environment. And finally, he loops back to language itself as a tool that helps us think conceptually and boost our memory.
Okay, that makes sense. So let's focus on thought and language then. Parrington links them to conscious awareness, rational thought, the things that make us human.
Pretty much. But how do they all connect? He talks about the FOXP2 gene, which got a lot of press as the language gene.
But it's not that simple, is it?
No. Gary Marcus's view, which Parrington highlights, is that FOXP2 is likely just one player in a bigger genetic network. It seems to control other genes involved in language, like one called SRPX2.
And what does SRPX2 do?
It's involved in forming synapses, those connections between neurons, especially in brain areas important for language. So you see this cascade effect.
Ah, okay. One gene influences another, which influences brain structure. It's complex.
Very. And the old model of specific language spots in the brain, Broca's area, Wernicke's area, is also being updated.
How so?
Newer research suggests language is more dynamic, involving a wider network of regions that also do other jobs. It's less like dedicated modules, more like a distributed system working together.
Makes sense, given how complex language is. Parrington also mentions language, starting even before birth.
Yeah, this is amazing. Brain scans of premature babies show they can already tell different voices apart and recognize language sounds.
In the womb.
Or very soon after premature birth. Yeah, it suggests the neural wiring for language starts developing really early.
Wow. A very deep biological root. What about inner speech? That voice in our head.
Vygotsky saw that as basically internalized social interaction. We learn to talk to ourselves based on how we talk with others. And others, like Voloshinov and Charles Freningholm, suggest it's not really a monologue, but more like a fluid back-and-forth dialogue within our own minds.
Like different perspectives arguing inside our head.
Kind of, yeah. Reflecting those social interactions we've internalized, it's a really thought-provoking idea.
It is. Okay, shifting again. Creativity and imagination. Vygotsky saw those as socially influenced, too.
Yeah, he thought our imagination gets broadened by social input, hearing descriptions, ideas from others, allows us to go beyond just our own direct experience.
And imagination helps us adapt, right? Deal with new situations.
Absolutely. It lets us mentally play with possibilities, come up with novel solutions. It wouldn't be very adaptive if our brains could only replay the past.
True. Is imagination located in one brain spot?
Doesn't seem like it. Brain scans show widespread activity during creative tasks, and emotions play a big role too.
Okay.
And some research on monkeys found overlapping neurons involved in both seeing something and remembering it. This might hint at how we conjure up imagined images, maybe by recombining stored memories.
Taking bits of memory and sticking them together in new ways.
That could be part of it. And Parrington talks about brain waves helping to synchronize activity across different brain regions during these creative moments.
Like conducting an orchestra.
Nice analogy. The prefrontal cortex seems key here, building internal models, managing information flow. Kind of like the conductor, yeah.
Interesting. Parrington also touches on the link between creativity and mental health issues.
Yes, it's a complex area. Some traits, like maybe having looser cognitive filters or being more drawn to novelty, seem linked to both creativity and certain mental states.
So a different way of processing information can be a double-edged sword.
Potentially, yes. It might lead to creative insights, but could also present challenges. It's not a straightforward connection.
Right. Okay, what about emotion versus reason? We often think of them as opposites.
Parrington argues against that, or at least against the simple mind as computer model. Our emotions are deeply rooted in our evolutionary history and powerfully drive behavior.
So they're not just irrational noise.
No, they're fundamental. He touches on the biology, different theories about how emotions arise, the brain circuits involved, like the limbic system.
And he introduces that 4E cognition idea.
Right. Embodied, embedded, enacted, and extended. It's the idea that thinking isn't just in the brain. Our body's embodied, our environment embedded, our actions enacted, and even the tools we use extended. It's a much more holistic view.
Okay. And emotions linked to reward and addiction, too.
Definitely. He discusses the dopamine system, how it drives reward seeking, and how things like social media cleverly tap into this with unpredictable rewards, drawing on B.F. Skinner's old work on conditioning.
Those variable rewards keep us hooked, like a slot machine.
Exactly. Parrington also briefly mentions psychedelic drugs.
What about them?
Research shows they can increase activity in perception-related brain areas, leading to that altered, sometimes expanded sense of consciousness. It's another angle on exploring the brain basis of subjective experience.
Fascinating. So this leads to the conscious versus unconscious mind, Freud's territory.
Yep, Parrington revisits Freud's idea of an unconscious realm influencing our thoughts and actions.
A hugely influential idea. What about the split brain studies, Sperry's work?
Right. Those studies on patients with a severed corpus callosum revealed hemisphere specialization left often linked to logic, language, right to intuition, spatial skills.
The classic left brain, right brain idea.
Kind of, but Sperry himself warned against oversimplifying it. The hemispheres have different strengths, but they are highly connected and normally work together seamlessly. It's more about complementary roles.
Got it. Not two separate people in one head.
Yeah.
How does this relate back to creativity?
Well, Parrington mentions brain imaging of jazz musicians improvising.
What happens in their brains?
They show less activity in parts of the prefrontal cortex, usually involved in self-monitoring and inhibition, and more activity in areas linked to generating new ideas.
So letting go of conscious control a bit allows creativity to flow.
That seems to be the idea, letting those less conscious processes come forward.
Okay. Now, this next topic is tricky. Sanity and madness. How do we even define normal?
Exactly. Parrington highlights that challenge. Mental health is a spectrum, and definitions of normality shift across cultures and time.
And the genetics of mental disorders. Are they like the gay gene complex?
Very complex. Large genetic studies, GWAS, often find the strongest links not in the protein-coding genes themselves, but in those non-coding regulatory regions.
So switches.
Yeah, which suggests environmental factors might play a bigger role in triggering these complex conditions compared to simpler single-gene disorders.
So genes might create a vulnerability, but environment pulls the trigger.
That's a common way to think about it.
Yeah.
He uses schizophrenia as an example. The old dopamine hypothesis is proving limited. Now there's more focus on the immune system, developmental factors, variations in DNA structure called CNVs. It's multifaceted.
Right. And Parrington shares a personal story here.
Yes, a very moving one about his sister, illustrating the real-world impact of these conditions.
And he mentions epigenetic inheritance of trauma being passed down.
Studies in animals suggest this might be possible. Stress in parents leading to changes in sperm microRNAs that affect anxiety and stress responses in their offspring. It's another layer of complexity.
Wow. Okay, moving to normality and diversity again, but focusing on autism.
Parrington discusses the history, including those harmful early ideas like Kanner's refrigerator mothers theory.
Which blamed parents. Totally wrong.
Totally wrong and deeply damaging. He then covers the genetic studies linking autism spectrum disorder to variations on specific chromosomes. But again, it's complex. Deletions and duplications of genetic material can be involved, making outcomes unpredictable.
So no single autism gene either.
Doesn't look like it. And Parrington rightly warns against dangerous, unproven cures.
Yeah, absolutely.
And importantly, he challenges the old stereotype of autistic people lacking imagination. Newer studies suggest unique forms of creativity can flourish with the right support.
It's about recognizing diversity and how minds work.
Exactly. The lines between conditions and normality are blurry. We need to appreciate the whole spectrum.
Which brings us to another difficult area. Crime and punishment. He uses the Yorkshire Ripper case.
Yes, Peter Sutcliffe. Parrington discusses the case and some criticisms of the investigation.
And the link between brain injury and crime. Phineas Gage.
Gage is the classic example. And modern research does show links between frontal lobe damage and changes in behavior, sometimes leading to criminality.
But it's not the only factor.
No. Parrington also stresses the role of severe childhood trauma in the lives of many serial killers, people like Ed Gein, Edmund Kemper.
So, again, that nature-nurture interaction. What about the two minds idea for psychopathy or DEEB?
He touches on that. While dissociative identity disorder gets a lot of play in fiction, there's less evidence it's common among serial killers. Psychopaths, though, show a clear lack of empathy. Brain scans show they don't process victims' fear or distress in the same way.
A fundamental disconnect.
Yeah. Parrington includes some chilling quotes showing the sense of being exempt from normal rules.
But he also says we need to look beyond the individual, right? As society.
Yes. He argues that we need to consider how societal values, especially in capitalist societies, might sometimes contribute to or reward certain psychopathic traits, particularly in fields like finance.
That's a provocative thought. leading into class and division more broadly.
Exactly. He contrasts early hunter-gatherer societies, which were likely more egalitarian, with the rise of agriculture.
Which led to hierarchies.
Surplus food, storage, ownership.
Yeah.
Yeah, it led to class divisions. Ancient Egypt is an early example. Slavery became common.
A tough part of our history. And patriarchy, too.
He links the rise of patriarchy, the subjugation of women, often with the rise of private property and inheritance systems. Gender power dynamics shifted significantly.
And how does this contrast with today? We talk about equality.
But Parrington points to the huge wealth inequality that still exists, citing Oxfam reports. There's a gap between the ideology and the reality.
And he mentions alienation under capitalism.
Yeah, the idea that the system can be alienating not just for workers, but maybe even for those at the top, potentially linking back to those psychopathic traits.
And social media's impact, especially on teens.
He touches on that too. Body image issues, online harassment, particularly affecting teenage girls' mental health. New technologies bring new challenges.
Okay, so faced with these divisions and pressures, what about resistance, rebellion?
Parrington goes back to those ancient Egyptian artisans striking for their wheat rations, a very early example of collective action, withholding labor.
Showing resistance isn't new. Modern examples.
He mentions recent UK university strikes that grew from pension disputes to broader critiques of education becoming like a market, and the miners' strike, where women took on new, more prominent roles.
So movements evolve and change people. What about revolutions?
He challenges simple views. They aren't usually just spontaneous riots or plots by a few leaders. He uses the Russian Revolution, starting with women demanding bread, as an example of unexpected origins and mass involvement.
Right, and he questions old ideas about mob mentality.
Yeah, critiques Laban's view of crowds as irrational. Modern research shows crowd behavior is more complex and context-dependent.
Okay, what about the rise of right-wing populism?
He suggests a link to feelings of insecurity, a sense of falling behind economically or socially among certain groups that fear of the downward escalator.
And why do people participate in terrible things? Milgram's obedience experiments.
He discusses Milgram's classic studies, showing how easily people obey authority, even when asked to do harmful things. Situational factors are incredibly powerful. Interestingly, a recent replication found women were less obedient than men.
Still chilling results, though.
Definitely. Parrington ends by stressing that individual actions matter, both in pushing for change and resisting oppression.
And he speculates about brain differences between conformists and rebels.
Yeah, suggests future research could look at brain areas like the amygdala, fear emotion, and prefrontal cortex, decision-making, in times of social upheaval.
Fascinating possibility. Okay, let's shift to something different. Music and rhythm.
Parrington sees our capacity for music as maybe a defining human trait, possibly built on abilities we share with other animals, but taken to a new level.
And brain scans show music affects us deeply.
Consistently across people, yeah. fMRI shows activity in regions for movement, attention, planning, memory, not just auditory areas. Daniel Abrams' work suggests it might have a fundamental neural basis for uniting listeners.
Wow. What about music in early societies? Hunter-gatherers.
Likely crucial for social bonding. Singing and dancing together releases endorphins, oxytocin, feel-good bonding chemicals.
Makes sense.
Plus, songs and dances allow for role-playing, exploring social themes, connecting to spirituality. It was a vital cultural tool.
And music reflects historical change. The French Revolution example.
Right. While Paris was in turmoil, Mozart in Vienna was writing profound music. It suggests times of upheaval can actually fuel creativity, perhaps through contradictions.
Interesting paradox. What about jazz? Bebop.
Parrington sees bebop, with its fast tempos and improvisation, partly as a form of resistance, musicians reclaiming artistic control, pushing back against being just background entertainment.
Musical democratization. And technology influences music too. The piano.
Absolutely. The development of the piano opened up new possibilities for composers like Beethoven. Tech shapes the art form.
So music, like language, is a cultural tool shaping consciousness.
That's Parrington's argument. And even pop songs, like Drift Away, can tap into collective feelings of unease or alienation, offering connection. Music reflects and shapes our inner worlds.
Okay, let's move to visual art and design, starting way back with cave paintings.
Yeah, let's go. Amazing glimpses into early symbolic thought. How do our brains appreciate art?
Is there a specific art appreciation circuit?
Not exactly. A meta-analysis suggests viewing art activates similar brain areas we use to evaluate everyday objects relevant to survival. Samir Zeki thinks our aesthetic sense might have evolved from judging things important for survival.
Huh. But art does more than judge survival value, right?
Definitely. Parrington argues art makes leaps, conveying new ideas. He uses Hieronymus Bosch, The Garden of Earthly Delights.
That really strange, detailed painting.
Exactly. Felt incredibly modern for its time, reflecting huge societal shifts, uncertainty.
And then Picasso, Les Demoiselles d'Avignon.
A revolutionary work. Shocking at the time. Parrington talks about Picasso's intense focus, maybe overlearning his subjects, contributing to its power.
And it changed how women were depicted.
Radically. Challenged the traditional male gaze, the passive female subject. A huge break with tradition.
What about film? Eisenstein and montage.
Eisenstein was influenced by Vygotsky, saw film montage as a tool to shape the viewer's emotions, a social technique of feelings, very deliberate manipulation of psychology.
Wow. And literature. The polyphonic novel?
Mikhail Bakhtin's idea, novels with multiple independent voices, like Dostoevsky's, versus novels with one dominant authorial voice. Bakhtin saw this reflecting the dialogic, multi-voiced nature of our own consciousness.
Like our inner speech being a dialogue.
Exactly. Parrington even wonders if Dostoevsky's epilepsy influenced his ability to portray these multiple inner worlds so vividly.
A fascinating potential link. What about Wuthering Heights?
Parrington sees Heathcliff as complex, not just a simple rebel. The novel explores intense passions that go beyond just social critique, juxtaposing the ordinary and the extreme.
And the turn of the screw, the ambiguity.
Are the ghosts real or not? Parrington suggests that ambiguity mirrors the uncertainty within our own thought processes. It resonates because our minds don't always have clear answers.
And Ishiguro's The Unconsoled.
Exploring themes of connection and isolation that struggle to connect resonates with a core part of being human.
Okay. Let's turn to science and technology. Parrington shares his own journey.
Yeah, I wanted to be a biochemist. He stresses that creativity is vital in science. It's not just memorizing facts, it's asking questions, making connections.
Challenging assumptions, like paradigm shifts, continental drift.
Wegener's theory is a great example. Initially rejected, now fundamental, science evolves through challenging old ideas. Parrington outlines the scientific method observation, hypothesis, experiment, and crucially, falsification.
Popper's idea trying to prove things wrong is how science advances.
Right, and serendipity plays a huge role too. Penicillin, microwave ovens, accidental discoveries.
Happy accidents. But science isn't totally neutral.
No. Societal values influence what gets funded, what questions get asked. And scientific discoveries themselves, like Einstein's relativity challenging Newton, can shift worldviews. Science happens within a social context.
And technology, printing press, internet.
Huge shapers of society and thought. They change how we interact, how we process information fundamentally.
Which brings us to the big questions. Mind and meaning.
Yeah, that human quest for meaning beyond just surviving. Where does it come from?
Religion and spirituality.
Parrington discusses potential evolutionary roots may be linked to our tendency to detect agency, to see intention even where there isn't any. Stuart Guthrie's idea about spotting predators.
So a tendency that helps survival might underpin religious belief.
Possibly. And beliefs vary hugely across cultures and time, ancient Egyptian afterlife, medieval heaven and hell.
And religion's role.
Yeah.
Social control, but also progressive movement.
Both. He uses Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress as an example, religious allegory, but also social commentary.
But meaning isn't only found in religion.
Yeah, Parrington emphasizes art, science, human connection as vital sources of meaning too. The fact that consciousness has a material basis in the brain doesn't diminish these achievements.
And he thinks human consciousness is unique, different from other life.
He argues it has unique properties, disagreeing with views like Christoph Koch's that see consciousness potentially even in simple systems.
Okay, what about symbols? Their power.
Immense. And their meaning can change drastically.
Yeah.
He uses the swastika from ancient symbol of good fortune to horrific emblem of Nazism, shows how history reshapes meaning.
Chilling example, and personal meaning from culture.
He shares his connection to Jan Tiersen's music from the film Amélie. Our individual experiences with art shape our personal sense of meaning.
And finally, facing mortality without supernatural beliefs.
A core challenge. Finding meaning in this life through human connection, knowledge, experience.
Okay. Mind and machine. This feels very current. Extending life. Uploading consciousness.
Parrington touches on these sci-fi, but maybe soon reality. Ideas, cyborgs, cryonics, mind uploading raises huge ethical questions.
Definitely. What about AI? The singularity.
Yeah, the idea that AI might surpass human intelligence. Kurzweil's predictions, but also warnings from Musk, hawking about potential risks alongside benefits.
But current AI still has limits compared to us.
Oh, yeah. Impressive in specific tasks, but lacks the general understanding, adaptability, and subjective experience of human consciousness.
And trying to create human-like intelligence in other animals,
I do.
transgenic monkeys.
Raises massive ethical concerns about manipulating other species' cognition. Where do we draw the line?
Big question. So the epilogue brings it all back together.
Revisits the central theme. Culture profoundly shapes the brain and mind. This impacts how we understand mental health, too.
Like Fernyhu's idea of schizophrenia as disrupted inner dialogue.
Exactly. Which could lead to better diagnosis, maybe using brain imaging during certain tasks, and understanding the spectrum of symptoms.
And the need to combine social and biological approaches.
Crucial. Parrington advocates for things like open dialogue therapy alongside medication. You can't really separate social and biological factors in mental health or consciousness.
It's always an interplay. He ends with a point about individual diversity.
Yeah, highlighting traits like unusual optimism or resilience to pain, like in Joe Cameron's case. Even with powerful cultural influences, there's inherent individual variation.
Her case is amazing, feeling almost no pain.
It really highlights that individual biological differences add yet another layer to this whole complex picture we've been exploring.
So, to sort of wrap up our deep dive today, the big takeaway is this continuous, intricate dance between our biology and our culture. That's what makes our minds what they are.
It's a dynamic process, constantly ongoing.
Right. And thinking about how fast culture and technology are changing now, it leads to a pretty big question for you, the listener.
hmm What new transformations might the human mind undergo in the future? And maybe more importantly, what responsibilities do we have in actually shaping that evolution?
Definitely something to mull over. We really encourage you to keep exploring these ideas, think about your own experiences. Thanks for joining us on the Deep Dive.